is time for The World This Week. As promised, I'm joined by a panel of opinionated journalists to take a look back at the top news stories of the past 7 days. Let's introduce you to the guests tonight. Then Vivienne Walt is a journalist at Time Magazine. Stefan de Vries is from RTL4. He's the Paris correspondent. Christopher Dickey is Newsweek magazine's Paris bureau chief and its Middle East editor. And Stephen Erlanger is Paris bureau chief for the New York Times. Good evening to you all and thanks for being with us tonight. Well, later in the show, we'll be discussing England's worst rioting in decades. Courts are staying open all night tonight to deal with the perpetrators, and the Prime Minister has promised to do whatever it takes to restore order on the streets. We'll also be talking about the ongoing brutality in Syria, where President Assad continues his bloody crackdown on protesters, despite some rare criticism from other states in the region. First, though, what a week it's been on global stock markets, as trillions were wiped off the value of global companies. Frantic politicians cut short their holidays to race home and pledge yet more austerity. However, if you look at this, it shows how little that did to stop the roller coaster ride. Well, today, France and others went one step further and banned the practice known as short selling. Some relief on the markets today, which are now trading higher, but who knows what next week will bring. Stephen Erlanger, what a week it's been, up and down, up and down. We've never seen swings like this, have we?
It's been a good week to sit tight with your eyes shut.
Yes.
I think basically, there's a lot of anxiety about low growth. I think that's really the problem. I mean, when the United States said that it could go into a double-dip recession, when growth was bad for the second quarter, it was completely flat for France in the second quarter. That has everybody nervous, because if you're not growing, you can't pay your debts, tax receipts go down, it makes the banks more vulnerable. So suddenly you had this feeling that the whole motor of the West was slowing. And I think that's, if there's any reason behind the madness of the markets, I think it's that. It's just suddenly one has the feeling that we thought it was all okay, but it's actually not going as well as we hoped.
Now, Stefan, are we seeing this week that investors are saying, quite frankly, we don't trust politicians anymore to get the economy back on course?
Well, that's quite funny that investors say that, because who would trust an investor? I wouldn't, sincerely. I think we pay too much attention to a bunch of morons who are high on adrenaline, testosterone and cocaine, probably. And I think it's very, very dangerous, the reactions. Also, we as a journalist, we shouldn't discuss too much about them. And I think it's all just one big theatre play, so I've been enjoying this week, as I've been the whole year, actually, because 2011 was a very interesting year so far, but I think this week tops it. All right, and remember, Stefan's views on traders are his own. Let me just point that out.
Christopher, where are you putting your money, Stefan? That's what I want to know.
That's what we want to know, absolutely.
The mattress, yeah.
Gold.
No, just spend it.
All right.
Good for the economy.
On a serious note, though, the ratings agencies have come under a lot of fire. First, of course, there was that downgrade by Standard & Poor's on the United States. So basically, what they're saying is Finland is more creditworthy than the world's biggest economy. And then, of course, we had rumours that France might indeed be next.
Well, I think the point that's been made again and again in the United States and in France and elsewhere is, who are these agencies to be passing these kinds of judgments? Particularly Standard & Poor's. I mean, these are the same agencies that were talking about these mortgage-backed securities as high-grade investment properties, high-grade investment vehicles. Well, and that's what got us into this mess to a very large extent. If Standard & Poor's had done its job 3 or 4 years ago, we wouldn't have the crisis that has been bringing everybody down ever since. So now they come out and they take what is an overtly political position and say, oh, well, the United States, it isn't living up to our Standard & Poor's standard for political action. And I think that a lot of people look at this askance, but the markets don't. The markets looked at it and said, this is a real problem.
And there is this argument again, isn't there, about growth versus austerity, because it seems that politicians just can't seem to get it right. They keep promising to cut spending, but at the same time, they have to promote growth as well.
Well, it seems clear that, especially in the US, there's been such an overwhelming focus on cutting the deficit, which is gigantic. But it's not necessarily the way to fix the economy. The economy is going through massive restructuring of massive innate changes, which are probably historic. there are millions of people out of jobs that might not come back to the US. And so it just from the outside, and especially perhaps being outside of the US, you can see a lot of like log jams in Washington without really tackling what seems to be a fundamental process, which is the lack of jobs. And you have companies that are making very good profits. Every day we hear about record profits, and yet they're not putting them into jobs.
Well, and one of the things that's happening is that as we keep cutting back government, you're laying off people from government jobs at every level, local level, state level, federal level. So even if the private sector is doing a lot of hiring and has been doing a fair amount of hiring, the joblessness goes up because all these people are being laid off from government jobs.
I mean, one of the arguments you're making, austerity versus growth, that has been the American versus European debate. And in fact, it was the Americans who were pushing stimulus. And that's one reason why the deficit has gone up so high, so fast. And Europe was pushing austerity, and we see what it did to Greece. But the problem is, it's slowed down now. America's not growing, and there's no more room for stimulus, which is one reason why the market's panicked, because it's like they took all the Dexedrine, and now they've run out of Dexedrine, and everything's slowing down. And if the American growth slows down, that means people are buying less. That means China will slow down. It certainly means Europe, which has traditionally low growth, will also slow down. And all these politicians have been counting on the growth of the economy to make up for these issues of sovereign debt. So it gets circular, but it's, I think, a real problem. I mean, people have come up to grips with the end of the argument about austerity versus growth. Now they don't know what to do.
Right, and there's a political element to it as well, isn't there? Because you've got political paralysis in Washington, some people are saying, and some are also calling the institutions in Europe woefully inadequate in dealing with this.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, the thing in America, you know, it was ugly. They kind of did what we all thought they would end up doing, but it looked pretty sloppy. My argument is that it wasn't so much the debate that got people shaken, but the fact that America was going to head into a double-dip recession, and that these cuts weren't shaped to help economic growth. I mean, that was the problem. And in Europe, you know, we've simply had a failure of European leaders to make a credible commitment to saving the euro.
Well, half of them were on the beach, weren't they?
But it's been short term after short term after short term, and we're in the same thing again. And either they're going to make the bet that's credible, or the Eurozone will eventually collapse. But I don't think there's a middle ground anymore.
Is it time to either cut losses on the euro or consider closer fiscal union now?
Yeah, the latter, because I don't think there's a euro crisis. The real crisis is an institutional crisis and a political crisis. The fact that we're with 27 people, 27 leaders, and well, they're not really leaders. They're just babbling, and they each tell something different. I was there at the summit at the 21st of July 3 weeks ago in Brussels, and I attended the press briefings afterwards. And Berlusconi said something different than Sarkozy, and the Dutch Prime Minister, whose press briefing I attended as well, said something completely different from Sarkozy, and it was only literally 5 minutes after the end of the summit. So how can you govern a country, or a fiscal union, if you want, if you like, with 27 different opinions? And the other problem is that Europe is not very popular with the most important countries right now in Europe. So the leaders of these countries, especially Angela Merkel, she's afraid to take a stand, to take a position, and to say we need to go to a closer fiscal union, or we go away and we just become a club of, you know, free trade association or something like that. Nobody makes a choice, nobody makes the decisions, and that's the whole problem. And nobody knows what they're doing, actually, and that's the reasons why the markets are so insecure.
It makes the US Congress look positively harmonious, doesn't it?
Well, I don't know about that.
It does seem like there's sort of an existential crisis within the Eurozone. Yeah. I mean, the fact that Germany is this reluctant to jump in again to rescue, the troubled Euro countries, means that you just have structurally an entity which I don't know how it can function through a really bad economic crisis where you have some members who clearly have the ability to rescue other members, but no political motivation to do so.
Well, you can see why. You can see why taxpayers in Germany are not anxious to bail out Greece or Spain.
Yeah,
Or
but at the
Italy.
same time, they're earning money with it. Nobody tells that because we're earning money right now with the help to Greece. It's just
Well, I mean, this is the whole
know.
point. I mean, everyone talks about bailouts, but actually these are loan guarantees.
yes, it's not giving
And-
money,
But Greek loans aren't guaranteed, are they? That's the whole
Well,
point.
sure they are.
but they're
Sure
still
they
paying
are.
back.
There have been
so-
2 bailouts
But when we're just
now.
above default grade, doesn't that mean that it's
but
just
I mean,
a slippery slope to
Greece,
default?
I mean, if I can just say for a second, I mean, Greece is quite small, and the Eurozone has agreed, with the help of the IMF, to give Greece whatever money it needs in return for certain actions. So if Greece works, it pays its loans back over time. I think that, they're going to have to continue to restructure the loans to give Greece more time. I mean, but what's so far, very few people have actually lost money. I mean, the reluctance
Nobody.
of the Germans is
So
to
far.
put out a blank check that's actually a guarantee for all these other places, because they're afraid that if they do that, these countries won't do what's necessary to get their economies in order. I mean, the problem is, the more guarantees they put out, the more expensive it can seem, and the more nervous the markets get about other countries like France.
Okay. All right, let's leave that there and move on to our next. And in the UK, there's been a lot of soul searching over the past few days about what prompted England's worst rioting in decades. What began as a peaceful protest in Tottenham over a police shooting quickly turned into something much more violent, with widespread burnings, vandalism and looting spreading across the capital and then to other cities as well. Well, Prime Minister David Cameron called the behaviour sickening. It was absolutely shocking what was going on this week. It was hard to believe that we were looking at scenes from one of the world's richest countries.
Well, but I mean, that's part of the problem, isn't it? A lot of people in Britain don't feel very rich. And the people who are poor are feeling a lot poorer a lot faster than anybody else. I mean, I don't want to make this a big social thing. I think there's a lot of vandalism and hooliganism, and I think there's a lot of people who make even the investors and the politicians look bad out there on the street. In fact,
I think I saw a couple of investors in there.
Yeah,
actually.
exactly. In fact, the discrepancy, probably on cocaine, the discrepancy between the poor and the rich in a lot of these societies in Europe has gotten more and more pronounced. And I think there's a lot of concern that this is the kind of thing in a long, hot August, or even a long, rainy August here in France, could erupt in other countries besides Britain. I think people are really very worried that all the things that we were just talking about on the economic front will manifest themselves with this kind of will affect this kind of street violence. And then people really don't know what to do. You can see that Britain, which has very good police forces, was caught completely unawares.
Really didn't see this coming at all. Even though police chiefs themselves had warned about this several times, hadn't they? They said, look, if you keep cutting the police numbers, we're not going to be able to deal with the rioting.
Right. No, I mean, I remember covering Britain, covering Tottenham, and covering riots in Birmingham, and those seem much more clearly about Thatcherism and cuts and unhappiness and rich versus poor, and also racism, let's be fair. I mean, these seem a little more confused. I mean, they started with racial anger, but what's interesting to me compared to France is that my impression is this was more, if I can put it this way, Christian rather than Muslim. I mean, the Muslim community didn't get too involved. In fact,
Well, they were hailed as heroes, in fact, weren't they?
Precisely.
Especially
That's
the
right.
Turkish community, when
And
they
that's-
defended their property.
That's right. And this is why I think maybe it might be different in Paris, because Paris is more of a Muslim issue and it's Ramadan, and people are a bit more quiet. But what was interesting to me this time was the way it spread from city to city, and the police were really, they would bring anti-riot forces down from Manchester, and then the riots would start in Manchester. And I think it's true they didn't act forcefully enough in the beginning, and gave people the sense that it was actually possible.
Well, I think also there's just a sense in Britain, and this is what people are really disturbed by, that the whole kind of moral underpinning of the society is broken down some way. And in fact, the Muslims probably have more developed moral code at this point than the sort of random people that were playing out in the streets, playing out this violence in the streets.
Right, and early accounts were saying that these are people with no stake in society, they've got no money, no jobs, no futures, and we're hearing today that some of the first people to be convicted have jobs. We've had a law student, an estate agent, even an ambassador to the Olympic Games. I mean, is this a kind of a mob mentality? Do people just get caught up in the excitement? Do you think there's an element of that as well?
Well, apparently it proves that Britain is a very equalitarian society, that everybody can participate.
Everyone can thieve.
Yeah, so that's a very good, that's a nice dream. But on a more serious note, I think, I'm not quite sure what happened in Britain. It was very hard to understand what happened, and people try to compare it to what happened here in France in 2005, but it's a completely different problem, and maybe we're not very surprised in France because we are more or less used to it, because the scenes that we have seen in the UK are of course very extreme, but we should not forget that in France something like this happens almost every month in smaller cities, or in Paris or in the suburbs. Well, not in Paris itself, but at least in the region. So the French are more or less used to these images, which are of course far more extreme in the UK right now, but I don't think we can compare, and I'm not quite sure what really triggered all this, because it has nothing to do with the shooting in Tottenham. It was just I really don't know actually.
All right, Vivienne, I want to get your view on this, but we are going to have to take a very short break, but hold that thought. When we come back, we'll have the international headlines for you, and we'll talk a bit more about what's going on in the UK this week.